I think one of the things that people lose sight of is, the goal is not just planting churches, it's the kinds of churches we're planting.
You are listening to Our Urban Voices with Dr. Alphonse Javed, a podcast that presents Christian narratives through diverse voices that impact urban ministry. Here is your host.
Hello and welcome back to our Urban Voices. I'm your host, Dr. Alphonse Javed. Today I'm joined by Drew Hyun, the founder and pastor of Hope Church New York City, a family of diverse churches in and around New York City. Today we'll be talking about the unique challenges of leading and pastoring in urban setting, as well as the importance of emotionally healthy leaders. Drew is also the co-founder of the New City Network, a network of urban churches that value multi-ethnicity, spirit-filled ministry, emotional health, and mission. Drew is part of the Emotionally Healthy Discipleship team, a movement that is dedicated to transforming church culture through the multiplication of deeply changed leaders and disciples. Drew loves cities, ESPN, and naps, and finding it a restful Sabbath when all three come together. He resides in New York City with his wife, Christina, and then they have two beautiful children. I'm sure he's going to talk about that in a minute. And let me welcome him. Thank you so much, Drew, for being here. I'm so glad that you took time and you are on our show. How are
Uh,
you?
it's such an honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
So let's start, brother, with a little introduction about your family.
Mhm.
I believe that families are important. They humanize us, and I think audience will connect with you well if they know a little bit about you and your background. So share with us briefly about your family.
Yeah, so my family consists of I'm married to my wife, Christina. We actually met in New York City. The church that I was working at, New Life Fellowship in Queens, we met back in 2004. We started dating in 2006, and then we got married in 2008. And so we've been married for 16 years now. We have two children, my son David, who's 12, our daughter Avery, who's 8 years old. And so they're a joy. We live right here in the middle of Manhattan, so on
That's
31st Street. So yeah, really grateful for my family and grateful to be living in the city.
That's awesome, brother. Before we started this conversation, I was sharing with Drew that my experience in New York City has been great. And just thinking about all of these different ministry that God has blessed, and especially thinking about New Hope in Queens, the way God has used this ministry to transform not only city leaders, but around the world too. When you think about city, you think about the need there and how desperate the city is for leaders. Is they need connections, they need help, but also city itself, though they don't see it, but they need the church. And I'm so happy when I hear, Drew, people like you who have vision and they receive that calling and they plant churches, and then the Lord blesses those efforts. So you are the founder of Hope Church in New York City, as well
Mhm.
as the co-founder of the New City Network. Could you share a bit about what each of those are and how they work together?
So Hope Church NYC, I was on staff at New Life Fellowship for 10 years in Queens, New York. And I left New Life in 2011. And during that season, my wife and I, we were wrestling with a lot of things. We were wrestling with the possibility of going overseas.
Mm.
And then soon, a church out actually in California. I was in the final stages of a church out in California. And I'm originally from California. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, but went to university up in Berkeley, California. So there was a church actually in the Bay Area that I was highly considering moving out to. And but we felt like God spoke to us to start Hope Church NYC. And the seed verse was really around Psalm 33:18, that those whose hope is in God's unfailing love. And the passage basically talks about how a king is not saved by the size of his army, a war horse is a vain hope for deliverance. But the eyes of the Lord on those who fear him, on those whose hope is in his unfailing love. And it was out of that verse that God really gave us a heart and a vision especially in a city like New York that is full of kings and
Mhm.
princes and queens and princesses and royalty, that what would it look like for us to be a people who weren't defined by our kind of worldly success, but we were defined by a people who deeply hoped in God's unfailing love. And so the seeds of Hope Church NYC were born really the summer of 2011. And then we started Hope Church NYC in 2012 and ended up not saying no to California, and then basically moving forward with starting what would become a family of diverse churches in New York City. So our dream was to really start what would be a movement of churches in the city. So instead of building one big mega thing, what if we could start multiple churches that were led and pastored by our friends, and that we could be networked together as mission friends? And so that was really the dream. And so 2012, the first church started in Hope Church NYC in Astoria, Queens. And then since that time, we went on to plant 14 churches, two of which have closed since that time. A few of them have taken on different names and designations, which is totally fine as well. And I ended up taking on the leadership of the third church that was started in Midtown Manhattan. And so currently I'm the lead pastor of the church in Midtown, but also, so the church that I lead is a multi-site church in Manhattan with one location in Midtown, one in the Upper West Side, and one in the East Village. So that's Hope Church NYC. Then in 2016, and Hope Church NYC started in 2012. Um, and then in 2016, myself, as well as a dear friend of mine, a pastor named Edwin Colon, who's a New Rican guy from Brooklyn, born and raised there, he started what became also a family of churches called Recovery House of Worship. That church is now called Next Step Community Church. And Edwin and I are dear friends, and we kept looking for ways to work together. And so, in the midst of working together and kind of being friends for a long while, along with the church that I was formerly part of, New Life Fellowship, I was just talking to different pastors. What if we were to start a network of churches somehow and we galvanized around certain values? And so that's when we said, well, what would the values be? We talked about, well, a particular heart for urban ministry, because all of
Mhm.
us were kind of settled in the urban context. Emotional health was a big value for us. Spirit-filled ministry, so believing in kind of the work of the supernatural work of the Spirit today in an accessible way. Multi-ethnic ministry with a slant towards justice, mercy, and empowerment of people of color, and then mission. And so when we defined those five values, we started to gather pastors and leaders together from around the city. And then we hosted an annual gathering where people from around the country started to come in. And then we would talk about being part of this network called the New City Network. So the network is really kind of our church planting arm. I think so far we've probably supported around 40 new churches, probably given away, I don't know, $2 million or so to helping start new churches all over the world. And Hope Church NYC is the church that I lead. And then some of the other Hope churches that are daughter churches of ours, they are still very good friends of ours, but they're led independently. So that's kind of the short story of like the founding of Hope Church and then the starting of the New City Network. It really is born out of doing ministry with friends. There's nothing I would rather do than just be able to be on mission together with friends. And
Yeah.
so that's kind of the genesis of Hope Church NYC as well as the New City Network.
Yeah, that's amazing. So New York is unique itself, but within New York, the idea of
Hmm.
urban ministry is so diverse itself, depending on who you're talking to. Walk us through the journey to urban ministry in New York City, your personal journey. So these are the things you were able to do because God allowed you, you brought people together. Is it because you were born in an urban setting and God brought you here and you were in why urban setting?
So first, I did grow up in Los Angeles, in the heart of Los Angeles, so which is an urban setting, but very unlike New York. Then I went to university in Berkeley, California, which was a college town, but close to, the urban Bay Area, San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley. So there were three options following graduation from university. One was to become a missionary and move to the Middle East. Another option that I was considering was to become a college pastor of a church that we had helped start when we were in university. I say we, my brothers, two of my brothers also went to Berkeley. And so there was a church that we were part of, and I was offered a position to become the college pastor of that church. But the summer between my junior and senior year, I came out to New York City, and this is summer of 2000. And back then, urban ministry, I know today, urban ministry, it's been popularized by Tim Keller. And so much of urban ministry today is really like a vision towards cultural renewal and urban renewal and working with influential culturally elite kind of people in urban settings. But the reality is, back in the 90s and the 2000s, urban ministry was not that. Urban ministry was like, you're going to do urban ministry if you're going to work in the hood. And so when I came in 2000, the summer of 2000, first I fell in love with the city. I love the pay. I mean, I love people. I'm a high extrovert. We were staying in Queens, and then we were basically serving different soup kitchens all around, soup kitchens and kids ministries and different urban ministry programs, recovery programs all throughout the city that summer, in summer of 2000. And I just fell in love with the city. And there was almost like this aha moment of like, the whole world is here. Now, New York City, more than any other city, I think, in North America, and again, I grew up in Los Angeles, so but New York just has a different vibe even than LA. If anything, actually, a pastor friend in Canada, he was once remarking to me about how, of all the cities in North America, New York has the most missionary feel. And what he meant by that is it's just so unlike any other place in North America. I mean, obviously Toronto could be close. You have cities like Chicago, but there's something about New York that feels like a mission field. And because it's so utterly different, even than other urban settings, not only the density, but the unique challenges that arise within the urban context. And so when I moved here in 2001, so I moved here, I was an intern at New Life Fellowship, and they were doing some extraordinary work with the poor through their community development corporation. And they had reached such a diverse population of people in Queens. And so I moved to New York in 2001, right before 9/11, September 5th, 2001. And I came really because I saw that the nations were here. I loved the city and I loved the church ultimately. And so then I stayed in the city. I mean, most Californians after a couple years, they're like, okay, let's move back to wherever I came from or to warmer weather or whatever else, or settle down as a family. I mean, thankfully, my wife and I, we've both been deeply committed to the city. She's actually from Houston, Texas, but we met at that church in Queens. And she knew that it was deeply kind of impressed upon my heart that I felt a strong call and pull to New York City. Again, there was that brief season when after I left New Life, when we were flirting with the idea of moving back to California, or for me at least, to be back to California. But again, we sensed that God called us and spoke to us through Psalm 33 to start Hope Church. And so now here we are, 12 years late after starting Hope, and still feel deeply called to the city. We love it here. We love raising our kids here. I can't imagine living anywhere else. This definitely does feel like home to us and to me. So yeah, so that's a little bit of our story of like how kind of that was all birthed. And like I mentioned, I think one of the things that I just love about the city is I love people and the diversity of people.
Right.
And so if cities are great for being a place where there's a lot of people, and so I love the energy that that provides. I love the diversity of that. I love the unique learning of people from various different backgrounds and dispositions. And so I'd say that's what I love about being here in New York and
That's amazing.
doing
That's a
ministry.
great journey. That's a great journey. And I think you're right. Unless you are called to urban ministry context and God established that, it's hard to stay there, especially in those moments when you are struggling to make decision whether God is calling you out of New York City to something else or not. Sometimes it's clear that you are being called what you are being called to, but it's not clear whether you are called from yet. So sometimes that, and sometimes it's the vice versa. You feel that you're called out of, but not sure to where.
Yeah.
And I think when those things come together, it becomes like, okay, I think God wants me to just settle down. But for other, that
Mhm.
means like, okay, go and do it.
Mhm.
So talking about all these organizations during your time in ministry in these organizations, what has stood out to you about the unique needs and challenges urban ministers face? Not the ministry, the ministers like you face.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's the very practical challenges are the conditions of the city that just make it difficult. For instance, and these are all things that whether you're a Christian or a minister or not, just a human being can make things difficult, is the exorbitant cost of the city.
Hmm.
One person just described cities as like, it's just like any other place, it's just extra, you know? So there's extra costs, there's extra time that things take to do. And as a result, everything just feels a bit weightier, and which adds to a certain kind of spiritual dimension, which adds to a certain kind of heaviness, and where the soil does not seem quite as open. It's a bit harder, it's slower. Yes, there's tons of people around, but doing ministry, it's just really hard to reach people because people have so many other interests and such little time and margin
Right.
for anything when it comes to God and the pursuit of God. One of the reasons why I'm so passionate about emotional health is I think that for urban ministers in cities in particular, staying emotionally and spiritually vibrant is exceptionally difficult just because of all those demands. And then I think what happens is those demands put a certain amount of stress on an individual and their
Hmm.
family because all those things, those practical needs, end up putting on more stress, which then
Hmm.
leads to a spiritual dynamic of even more feelings of anxiety and fear and loneliness.
Hmm.
So I think the feelings of loneliness, anxiety, what do I do with the anxieties I'm feeling about money?
Hmm.
All of that leads to a certain kind of stress and suffering that is difficult to bear with unless one is super intentional about remaining emotionally and spiritually whole.
Hmm.
And so I think of many of the stories of pastors and leaders in the city, for instance, who have burnt out or who have had moral failures or things like that. In many ways, I sympathize so deeply with them because I recognize, gosh, there's so many unique challenges of being an urban minister, which is again why I'm so passionate, deeply passionate about emotionally healthy discipleship. So, so I think those are some of I'd say urban ministry is just like anywhere else. It's just more than it's more diverse, it's more crowded, it's more dense, it's more costly, it's more uncomfortable.
Hmm.
And so
Yeah.
living with those, and again, that's where someone almost needs, if someone's coming from outside the city, of course, if someone grew up here, this is just normal life. But if someone's coming from outside the city, I have to really approach it like a missionary mindset. Like this is a
Right.
cross cultural experience that I just need to become fluent with.
Hmm.
And then the challenges of cost and money obviously intensify the certain anxiety that comes with living here.
That's right. You describe New City Network as a network of urban churches that value multi-ethnicity, spirit-filled ministry, emotional health, and mission. Tell us
Mhm.
more about emotional health. You just talk about that a little bit again here as a challenge that ministers face. So, what does that mean, emotional health? What does that mean, and why is that important?
When we were starting churches, there was a big movement to start new churches, start new churches, start new churches, which I'm all for. Multiplication movement, the Great Commission. I think one of the things that people lose sight of is, the goal is not just planting churches, it's the kinds of churches we're planting. Are they vibrant and full of health? Are they places of integrity that mimic the Sermon on the Mount? And so when we talk about emotional healthy discipleship, we
Hmm.
talk about certain cultural factors that lie with a culture of emotional healthy discipleship. For instance, slowing down to be with God and practices like Sabbath keeping and the daily office and things like that. But we also about kind of a growing sense of self-awareness, especially around our emotions and what do we do with our anxieties, our fear, our anger? And will we allow God into even those spaces? And am I aware enough? And are there tools around me that have brought me to such an awareness of my own kind of unhealth or grief that I need to process or things like that? And so when we talk about emotional health as a value, it's not necessarily, hey, let's start new churches and do all this mission stuff. It's more so, let's do all this mission stuff, but really, what are we multiplying?
Hmm.
Are we multiplying on health? Or are we multiplying faithful following of Jesus that looks like healthy disciples who are not living beyond their limits, but instead are walking in step with the Spirit and are growing in self-awareness and being loving people to others, especially our enemies. So that's probably how I would sum up emotional health as it relates to that value and why we need churches like that and why we need to be having these kinds of conversations.
Are churches able to join the New City Network? If so, how would they do that?
Well, right now we've wrestled with that. Right now, the New City Network simply hosts different gatherings.
Okay.
And then we've given out different grants. We've wrestled with whether or not there should be like a membership process for new churches. However, we just haven't come to formalize anything and remain steadfast with it. Meanwhile, with Emotionally Healthy Discipleship, that organization that I also work with, we are in the process of building out a certain kind of network related to emotional health.
For now, it's gatherings and grants, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So gathering grants and go.
Yes.
That
Yeah.
there's your 3 points, right?
Yep.
All right. So okay, let's also talk about emotionally healthy discipleship team, a
Hmm.
movement that is dedicated to transforming church culture through the multiplication of deeply changed leaders and disciples.
Hmm.
How did you get involved with this, and why is this needed? So I understand your context from New Life Church Queens. We know
Yeah.
that the the whole movement there, or books and the founding pastor and all the other details. But go a little beyond that. Help me to understand you personally, how did
Yeah.
you get involved, and why you feel this is it? This is what we need.
Yeah, the way I got involved was I was an intern at a church that I had no idea they had this background in emotional healthy discipleship.
For
Uh,
real. Huh.
I basically went to go serve the poor, and it just so happened that Pete and Jerry Scazzaro had been on this journey already for about 4 to 5 years, where they had been journeying around a crisis that happened in their own marriage and ministry leadership, and them being now on this pathway of how do we reframe the way that we do marriage, relationship, leadership, and all that good stuff. And so for me, I feel like it was the providence of God that landed me at New Life Fellowship because I did not move there to learn emotional healthy discipleship. I went there to learn how to serve the poor. And then in so doing, that whole journey would change my life. And one of the reasons why it has been so impactful to me to this day is the background I came from. I came from an immigrant church context, which was doing some amazing work in connecting immigrant families from Korea in Los Angeles. But there was a lot of unhealth in those churches as well. There
Right.
were church splits. There were fist fights amongst the elder faction with the, pastors faction. And then even in my own home, my father later became a minister, but he was someone that my brothers and we had a really hard and harsh relationship with. And so we had a really hard time like seeing the public face of what Christianity looked like in the church, as well as in my dad, who was a clergy now, versus what Jesus taught about. They seem so different than each other. So that had been my experience. And then, I go off to college, wrestle with faith myself, finally make a decision to become a full-hearted Jesus follower. But I could see the same was happening in my own life. There was this
Mm.
exterior world of Christian leadership,
Yeah.
but then there was anger, fear, addictive behaviors that like started to emerge in my own life. But
Hmm.
like what I grew up with was like, it's okay to do that. It's okay to have two faces. And then here I am now, all of a sudden, is this 22-year-old at a church called New Life Fellowship, like where I came to serve the poor, and the pastor here is talking about like, hey, let's deal with some issues of your family of origin. Let's really dig into the power of the past.
Did you did you develop the tree?
Yeah, yeah. So
Family
like
tree.
so now
Good.
all of these things, yeah, the genogram. I mean, so we're working on all these things. I'm like, I came to learn how to serve the poor, and here I
Right.
was being confronted with the ways that I used to live.
Yeah.
And so now I'm being invited, like, how does the gospel, not just what do you say you believe,
Correct.
but how does the gospel speak into all of the deep father wound that you carry?
Hmm. Hmm.
How does the gospel speak into how you are so driven, Drew, by success and wanting to be a success in the world's eyes, even as a pastor? So there's all these different ways in which I think God has been since that time, like teaching me of what it means to follow Jesus, not to do things for God, but to do things with God and to first be with God. And out of being with God, having a life that's full of integrity, having a marriage and relationships that mirror kind of the ways that Jesus wants me to live, with
Yeah.
authenticity instead of living a double life and
Mhm.
hiding behind some of my shame and pain and things like that. So that was my first introduction to it. And ever
Mhm.
since then, I think what I've noticed about myself is that ministry leadership is incredibly difficult because I'm so unaware of my own blind spots and I'm so
Mhm.
unaware of my own power.
Mhm.
And so as a result, even the rising kind of stories of leadership abuse and spiritual abuse, I mean, so much of that, I believe, is because leaders are unaware of both of those things. We're unaware of our shadow, our blind spots,
Mhm.
and then we're unaware of our power. For me, it's kind of just a continual journey of growth, of hopefully humbly being able to grow in self-awareness,
Mhm.
make amends with the sinfulness that is inherent to me being a human being first before being a Christian leader. And then hopefully wanting to live with as much integrity as possible in my home, in my leadership, and in all those
Mhm.
different areas of my life. So that's how it's become such a significant value for me is because I grew up with such a different kind of way of seeing
Mhm.
spirituality and
Mhm.
and then being confronted with some of my own hidden shame, addictive
Mhm.
behavior, like I needed to come to a place of like, wow, God, please transform me from the inside out.
Amen.
Help me to follow you and help me to lead others, not in
Mhm.
this fake, overly spiritualized way, but in
Mhm.
a way of like, I've really been transformed and I want to take other people along the journey as well.
I think this idea of authenticity and self awareness, these things are lost, not even in Asian cultures. I come from Pakistan, and you have shame and honor system, and you at least grew up here in the United States, born and raised here. For me, it was different. First 25 years, 24, 25 years, I was in Pakistan. So that was like deeply rooted thing. Double face of ministers at
Yeah.
home, different out there. So yes, that honor shame was there. That Asian mentality is there. No matter what, you protect your parents, you protect your family. You gotta, even if when I was here for 20 years already and I'm still protecting, I was like, what's the point? Right? And I think that translates also into American mind too, because Americans are no different. A lot of time we think they are, oh, East and West. No, when you go back to this idea of deep father's wounds that you talked about, these are there. Pick up any story, anything. A lot of confusion comes out of that when you sit down with some folks who are struggling with identity or dealing with some sort of addiction or the way they're treating women. As a pastor, when you sit down with these men, they share those stories with you
Hmm.
and they connect those stories back to how they were treated somehow, somewhere in this subconscious. Those deep father's wounds are the cause, and I think shame is there, and getting over that and letting that go. And that I had to, just like you were sharing your journey, in
Hmm.
my journey I had to come to a point where I was like, no, I'm not my dad. I'm a
Mm,
different man.
yeah.
Either I can live with those all the things that he did, and those hesitation and shame and possibilities that could be, would be, all those things, or I can be what you're just saying, try to live according what type of disciple I want to be of Jesus. How can
Yeah.
I make it simple and have that self-awareness and have people around me who are covering my blind spots, and also trying not to hide my blind spot, not to be
Right.
blinded by the presence of those blind spots. I may not know the blind spots, all of them at least, but at least being aware is something. So I think in many ways that is definitely one of the top need in in the church, especially among men.
Yes.
How to be men that God has created us to be, but that means first confronting your own demons
Mm,
and confronting your things that has brought you up with certain face in the house. You are a yeller, outside suddenly you are sweeter, or vice versa. I don't know.
Yeah.
But some people do project they are more manly because they can say certain things and brag about certain things in the public, but at home they are sweetheart. I was like,
Yeah.
or vice versa, they're sweetheart outside but not at home.
Right.
So I'm glad that you are talking about these things. Emotionally healthy discipleship is not just, to me, it's not only for pastors to execute in their congregation, it's for the pastor to live by. We need to be healthy, emotionally healthy disciples of Jesus first. Can you describe the team's discipleship model?
For our church,
Yeah.
yeah, when I talk about discipleship, I usually talk about what's caught and what's taught.
Okay.
So what's caught is just the culture that we are, that this is it's kind of like there's so many stories that I can think of just watching Pete, who was again like a spiritual father to me, just watching him and seeing the culture that was caught. In terms of what's taught, we our discipleship pathway looks like Alpha, which is a first step.
Mhm.
It's an environment for people to come and explore faith. It's built around the table and hospitality and prayer. And then we have emotional healthy discipleship. And emotional healthy discipleship has two parts to a course, 2 8-week parts. The first part is emotional healthy spirituality, which was an 8-week course. And then the second part is an 8-week course on emotionally healthy relationships. And so we are journeying with people through these courses in a disciple making way to actually introduce them to what does it mean to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind? And what does it mean to love others as you love yourself? That's the path that we say of, hey, here's what's taught. Now, in terms of what's caught, it's as I'm working through a conflict with someone and I'm walking through them with the skill of incarnational listening, like that's what's caught. Like, hey, here's the kind of culture that we're trying to build. Are we a place that's open to feedback, or are we a place that's tends to be very one-sided and defensive
Mhm.
when it comes to treating people a certain way? The discipleship courses are basically our main pathway for discipling people. And then there's obviously the culture that we're trying to build here.
That's excellent. Who can participate in the program? Do they come from similar church traditions? Is there anything in common amongst participants?
I think anyone who has a hunger for God, I think people from various different denominations, church backgrounds can hopefully embrace the principles therein. I mean, we're simply trying to point people to a deeper mode of discipleship
Mhm.
when it comes to a prayerful life, a prayerful contemplative life where my relationship with Jesus is first, and then practices that help me live out Ephesians 4, speaking the truth in love to one another.
If a ministry leader is looking for discipleship of this sort,
Mhm.
where do you recommend they start?
I would recommend they go to emotionallyhealthy.org.
Okay.
Yeah, emotionalhealthy.org. There's an assessment there. There's several tools. There's an introduction to those courses that I just mentioned. Yeah, that's where they could find everything that they would need.
Switching gear again, in 2020, Hope Church began the hub,
Yeah.
a communal space in Midtown. Can you tell us more about that? What is it? Why is it important?
Yeah, we purchased the building right here in Midtown on 31st Street and Park. And, most building campaigns for most churches is like, hey, give to this thing so that we can basically build a bigger building where we can add more seats and where we could have really sweet kids spaces. Nothing against that. I hope that every church is able to have more seats and more better kids space. But we basically said, hey, let's purchase a space that we'll only be using 10% of the time.
Mm.
And the other 90% of the time, we will offer it to other nonprofits, missions agencies, organizations, church plants that are doing incredible work in the city.
Wow.
So we called this campaign to raise money to purchase this building the For the City campaign. So we purchased this building and we call it the Hub intentionally. We don't call it Hope Church NYC or the Hope Building. We call it the Hub because we want it to be a space that multiple churches, ministries, nonprofit organizations from around the city feel like it's a space that they can use at an affordable rate
Mhm.
to accomplish their purposes of serving marginalized communities or reaching people or proclaiming the gospel. And so last year, 78 different organizations used this space.
Wow.
And according to our calculations, based on comparable space here in Midtown, we saved organizations a total of $213,000 based on because we were offering such affordable rates when it came to renting out our property. So
How big
uh,
is it?
it's a 7-story building, but the bottom 4 floors are the commercial floors. The largest space fits about 70 people. So it's not terribly large. So our church doesn't even meet here on Sundays. There's 2 different church plants, one an international church and one a Spanish-speaking church that meets here in the morning and in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the 3 locations that our church gathers in, they're much bigger than the hub. But this space is perfect for church plants and for like I mentioned, mid-sized nonprofit gatherings and things
Yeah.
like that.
That's good. That's
Yeah.
actually a good resource. I'm part of this network called Heart for Muslims, which is
Yes.
a bunch of organizations are part of that too. And often we end up hearing about, hey, is there a meeting space?
Yeah.
And I'm glad that we are talking because I can connect people there too.
Yeah.
Same thing. That is part of Global Gates. That is part of so there are a bunch of that's and the network of
Yes.
agencies working among Muslims. So often we end up talking about this. That's why I asked specifically how big the space is. It's
Yeah,
good
of
to know.
course. Of course.
Yeah. Before we close out today's episode, is there anything else you like to add?
No, I just thank you for the work that you're doing. I'm so grateful for your heart, your
Yeah,
passion, your pioneering energy around missions and the urban context. And so a big fan.
absolutely. Thank you. God bless. If listeners wants to get in touch with you, how can they do so?
Gosh, I've just started to get more active on social media, but
Good.
yeah, so it's just at Drew Hyun, Hyun, at Drew, DrewHyun on Instagram and Twitter and that sort of thing. So,
Great.
although I'm not super active, but I'm just starting to get more active.
Good. I'm glad that you are, and this information will be included in the episode's description so people can get in touch with you. That's part of the whole mission of our Urban Voices. This is our way to connect people who cannot be in one place, and God is blessing our effort, different cities around the world in
Yeah.
urban setting. So it is good, and we do get to see those connections.
Yeah.
And for the last thing, because we talk a lot about, sometimes we really talk about very depressing topics when you're talking about persecuted church and you're talking about somebody comes to Jesus and now his family is after them. But sometimes we get to hear these kind of beautiful reports where God is growing something in the city, and it's beautiful. But nevertheless, I like to ask my guests to end with a joke. So please tell us a joke.
Here's one that my kids were telling me. What's colorless and smells like carrots?
What?
Bunny farts.
Oh my God. You didn't put
So,
that on the podcast. Come
yeah,
on.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry if that was,
No,
yeah.
that's okay. I want to let people know. Family, remember, they
There you go.
humanize us. So
Yeah.
hopefully people will hear this. Thank you so much for being on the show again. That was Pastor Drew Hyun. And thank you to all our listeners. We truly could not do this without you. If you learned something, have a topic suggestion, or would like to leave us feedback, drop us a note at oururbanvoices.com. Be sure to subscribe to the show and leave an honest review wherever you listen to your podcast. Tune in 2 weeks for more honest discussions from diverse voices.
You've been listening to Our Urban Voices with Dr. Alphonse Javed, which presents Christian narratives through diverse voices that impact urban ministry.